Proxima Centauri is a low-mass star that is part of the Southern Centaurus constellation. The star is 4.24 light-years away from Earth. If you had a powerful enough laser, it would take the beam of light 4.24 years to get to the star. When you look up at the star, you're actually perceiving it as it was 4 years ago. The current fastest moving object made by man is the original Voyager probe. It is traveling over 35,000 miles per hour, and even at such an extreme velocity, it would take thousands of years to reach it. The only practical way to get there is via faster than light travel, or FTL for short. According to Einstein, a fundamental rule of the universe is nothing but light itself can go that fast. The year was 2037, and that was the year we broke that rule. But at what cost? My name is James Anderson. I've been in the Air Force for 15 years, and it's always been said I was the best man they ever had. 2 years ago, I got an invitation from NASA to take part in a groundbreaking project. NASA was always a dream of mine. As a boy, I've always dressed up as an astronaut on Halloween and read basically all the books on them and the history of spaceflight. So joining the Air Force was the next best thing, and I ended up enjoying it a lot. I was stationed at Edwards Air Force Base as a test pilot for experimental fighters. The director of the project went by the name of Dr. Robert Butler. Robert was a tall ginger man with a brain that would make even Einstein envious. Robert was the person who personally invited me to partake in this project. I accepted almost instantly when he called, and we set up a meeting to discuss details. The meeting place was a nondescript office building in the middle of Bethesda, Maryland. Robert's office was probably the cleanest room I've ever been in. He had a huge mahogany desk with a computer monitor that spanned almost half the desk on the corner. Behind him was a bookshelf full of books and miniature model aircraft. A pleasant autumn aroma filled the air from the incense he had burning on the other side of the room. He sat me down with a handshake and started. "Hello, James. Thank you for meeting with me today. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to explore the opportunities in front of me," I responded eagerly. "Let's get the formalities out of the way so we can get down to business. I need you to sign a non-disclosure agreement as this project is classified top secret," he continued. Robert slid me a thick document. As I suspected, it was the aforementioned agreement. I had signed thousands of these in the past, so I knew the drill. It basically said that if you discussed the project with anyone outside its scope, it was considered treason. I promptly signed the document with the expensive fountain pen he had on his desk, half expecting him to leap out of his seat, telling me it was a display piece only. He didn't. Passing the document back to him and returning the pen, I thanked him and asked, "So, what is this groundbreaking project you speak about?" "Are you familiar with the theoretical physicist Miguel Alcubierre?" Robert asked with a curious expression. "I have read about him. He theorized a way to travel faster than light, but that theory was disproved a long time ago," I retorted. Robert sat back in his chair and went on. "What if I told you we recently revised his work and put it into practice?" Another question popped into my head. Miguel's FTL engine required significant power to function. Nothing on Earth can create that much energy. "Yes, James. Legitimate question. The scientists at the CERN Large Hadron Collider have been able to find a way to produce large amounts of antimatter. We have produced enough for a trip to Proxima Centauri and back with a little extra," he answered. "So you've built a ship?" I asked. "Yes. We're calling it the Triste, after the submersible piloted by Jacques Picard that dove into the deepest depths of the ocean." "It seemed the most appropriate," Robert replied. I was humbled to be part of something so much bigger than myself. I would have a chance to shape the future of mankind and affect many generations ahead of me. My heart started beating rapidly as I inquired, "How fast does it go?" "According to our calculations, the Triste has a max velocity of 32.47 times the speed of light, and you're going to be her pilot," he answered, as if waiting for this question the whole time. Before I could ask the date of the flight, he handed me a contract that outlined the whole project. Upon signing the contract, Robert set me up with living accommodations and held out his hand. I shook it and left to move into the apartment he provided for me. After I settled in for a week, Robert invited me back to a spacious conference room to meet the others who would join me on this pioneering flight. Robert called 4 people into a line, each at the top of their respective fields and eager to change history. The first I was introduced to was engineer Dr. Pravina Cook. Pravina designed and helped construct the reactor and FTL drive. She was a shorter woman, maybe just over 5 feet, with long dark hair in her 30s, but what she lacks in height, she damn sure makes up for in intelligence. The next person I was introduced to was Dr. Haruto Moon. Dr. Moon was the medical doctor. He was tall, with short hair, in a suit. Haruto was recently in the running to become Surgeon General, so NASA jumped at the opportunity to invite him. Then I met the chief scientist, Dr. Elizabeth Murphy. Elizabeth was one of the most beautiful women I've ever set my eyes upon. Her eyes were like diamonds. My gaze was so transfixed on her smiling face before the man next to her cleared his throat. I snapped out of it and shook her hand and his. The man was the commanding officer of the Triste, Colonel Edward Thompson. Thompson didn't look like anything like the colonels I've worked with over the years. He was short and thin, so not very intimidating. I showed him the proper respect nonetheless. Before our handshake was finished, he leaned down to my ear and whispered, "I saw how you looked at Elizabeth. That's not what this mission is about. So if you would kindly keep your dick in your pants, this will all go ever so smoothly." I nodded before joining him in the line. Robert handed us each a glass of champagne and gave a toast. To New Horizons. We all clinked our glasses and socialized. The very next day was orientation. We all met in the same conference room. It was that day I finally got to see the Triste. Although it was only a render on the wall, it looked like I was looking at the real thing. At the front of the craft was a large spherical command structure, probably where we controlled everything. Behind the sphere was what looked like a communications array. Then there was the reactor sandwiched between 2 vast rings. The rings were the main component of the FTL drive. Behind that, at the direct aft of the ship, were the main engines for standard propulsion. Flanking the reactor were 2 cylindrical tanks for the fuel. One had antimatter, and the other tank contained matter. Those 2 substances emit vast amounts of energy when combined. The reactor controlled that and converted it to energy. Robert began by explaining why he chose Proxima Centauri. As you may already know, Proxima Centauri is the closest star to Earth other than the Sun. This makes it an excellent candidate for this project. That's not the only reason we chose it though. For a little over 40 years, that star has been emitting bursts of ultra-high energy radio waves. When analyzed, the signal is random in nature, basically bursts of static. Don't stars emit all kinds of energy? I questioned. Yes, James, you are correct. The remarkable thing about these ones is they happen every hour on the dot. If that wasn't strange enough, every burst is completely identical, he continued. The room fell silent, as everyone was in a state of shock. Robert chuckled. That was my exact reaction. Your task is to travel to the star and use the equipment you bring along to study it and find out what causes the signals. I smiled when I saw the joy in Elizabeth's face. Stars were her area of study. Robert began answering more questions we had. Some important particulars stood out to me. The Trist is still under construction in orbit, and it would take about 1.5 months to reach the star at max speed, and we are scheduled to depart in 1 year after vigorous training. Our orientation ended, and I went home. NASA put my body to its extreme upper limit over that year. I have never been tested like that, not even during my time in the Air Force. In one of the simulations, they put me in a chair attached to a spinner that spun incredibly fast to simulate G-forces. Another time, I was put in a chamber for several hours under high atmospheric pressure to see how I responded to the change. After many tests like this, me and my shipmates were ready to go. The launch day had arrived. This was a top secret mission, so the trip to the Soyuz rocket that would take us up was oddly void of reporters. I didn't have anyone to say bye to, which was one of the reasons I was selected, as there was every chance the ship could just explode. The Soyuz rumbled to life as it violently carried us up. I had never been so uncomfortable in such a comfortable seat. Eventually, the rumbling stopped, and I felt weightless. Moments later, Elizabeth screamed with excitement. "Look!" I watched out the window. Before me was the Trist in all her magnificence. It was surrounded by the scaffolding used to help in the construction. The capsule docked with the ship, and we boarded. Before me was the command center and the finest technology that humanity had to offer. At the front was a single grand console, my console, used for navigation. The ship oddly had gravity, although I didn't know how it worked. I hiked across the spacious room to my console so I can examine it. To my left was a small joystick, like you would find on an arcade cabinet. It was used to control the reaction control thrusters that steered the ship. There was a camera system there, so I could see where we were going. Directly in front of me was an extensive celestial map, so I could see where we were and plot courses. Overlaying the map were the controls for the FTL drive, which were simple. Provina handled the complicated aspects naturally. Finally, to my right, was a simple throttle for the main engines and a multifunctional display of factors like power level and velocity. Colonel Thomas shouted, "Alright everyone, to your stations." Provina and Elizabeth took their stations on either side of me. Elizabeth's station had full access of all the sensors and scanners installed on the ship. They allowed her to study the star. I don't know how to explain Provina's console, as it was too complex for me. My job at that moment was to make sure that the navigation system was aligned and the engines were ready to fire so we could head out. We spent a couple hours preparing as the scaffolding around the ship was taken away. Robert called over the radio. "Alright, everything looks good from our end. Proceed whenever you're ready." "Thank you, Robert. We will contact you as soon as we are in position to go light speed," replied the colonel. "James, take us out," he ordered. I tapped on the console, firing up the engines, and the ship gained speed. We could not perceive it though, due to the artificial gravity. The ship needed to be far from Earth in case of a disaster. If the ship were to blow up, it would be equivalent of 500 megatons of TNT. The engines were incredibly powerful. On one camera, it gave me a view behind the ship, and the Earth was visibly getting smaller. Eventually, we got out of range. I cut the engines and let the Trist coast. "We are in position, sir," I informed Thomas. He relayed the information to control. "This is it, people. Charge the rings, James," he instructed. I started the charge sequence, and the ship began to hum as the rings roared to life. Looking at the readout, it read 2 minutes to charge. "2 minutes to charge, sir," I shouted excitedly. There was an atmosphere of excitement and anxiety. However, everybody was a little nervous. My panel turned green as the coils finished charging. The colonel knew this and had a seat. After the click from his harness, he addressed the crew. "Whatever happens,
You've all made humanity proud. James, engage.
I had the biggest smile on my face as I nodded and did as instructed. We heard a loud burst of energy. Colors dazzled our eyes as we gazed out of the front window. What followed was an unnerving silence. I came to my senses and studied at the panel in front of me. Holding steady at 24.5 C. We are stable, I exclaimed. A wave of relief washed over all of us before we started celebrating. What I saw out the window is hard to explain. It was like we were flying through a blue tunnel of light. Pravina promptly checked the drive for any issues. She found none. We all congregated in the mess area for a meal, while Dr. Moon examined himself and the rest of us for any negative effects of our transition to light speed. To his amazement, we all looked perfectly healthy. Dinner was disgusting freeze-dried chicken, or what looked like chicken and tasted more like rubber. Despite the horrible cuisine, we were all happy as could be. To us at the time, we just made history. It was the life goal of every human being. We were proud. Soon, it was time to sleep for the long trip. Thompson ushered the crew into the sleeping chamber, and we each got into our respective pods. The pods were programmed to wake us up 5 hours before we reached Proxima Centauri. Pravina checked over the systems methodically before getting into her pod. She didn't want there to be any problems while we were sound asleep. As my pod closed, I felt claustrophobic before gently drifting into a deep slumber. I awoke seemingly minutes later to a blinding light. Dr. Moon and Elizabeth, with those beautiful eyes, were standing above me. She smiled, saying, "We're here, James." I slowly sat up and got out of my pod. The other two crewmates were awake as well. Dr. Moon gave me a pill to help me recover from the extended rest. Thomas asked where we were. The walk to my console was a little awkward as it felt like I was learning to walk again for the first time. The console read an ETA of 4 hours, 13 minutes, and 53 seconds. I turned to Dr. Moon. "I thought we were supposed to wake at 5 hours, not 4 1/4. "You're right, we had a little problem with your pod. It wouldn't open," he replied with a concerned expression. The crew and I spent the remaining 4 hours getting food in our bodies and checking the systems. It was fish this time, equally rubbery as the chicken. Eventually, it came time to shut down the drive as we had arrived. I shut it down and the ship came to a stop. There was a blinding light out the window. I was looking at another star. It just sunk in, the gravity of what we had just accomplished. I don't think I was the only one with that feeling. Thompson then shouted an instruction, "Bring us into orbit of the star, James." With a permanent smile on my face, I acknowledged and used my console to fire up the engines and put us into orbit. "Are we able to filter out the blinding light?" Thompson asked unanimously. Elizabeth spoke up. "The window has one. I'll activate it." My heart hit the deck, plating with an audible thud when she activated the filter. I observed the star being covered in green vine-like structures. It almost seemed organic. Proxima Centauri looked alive. It was visibly throbbing, and I was terrified at the sight. "What the hell? That's not what a star is supposed to look like," Thompson said shockingly. Elizabeth tapped her panel with determination. She concluded that with spectrographic analysis, the star was indeed organic. There was nothing in her analysis that pointed to it being a star of any classification, other than the blinding light it emitted. How could we not have seen this with all our instruments on Earth? I concluded that it was somehow being able to trick them from this vast distance. Elizabeth noted with a puzzled expression, I don't understand how this is possible. How long until the next radio burst? The colonel asked. 5 minutes, she replied as she checked her panel. As we waited, I was a nervous wreck. 5 minutes came and went. The radio pulse came and went as well. I felt a slight tingling sensation, but it was harmless. We were monitoring the signal, and it was the same as previously recorded pulses, according to Elizabeth. What do you make of all this, Dr. Moon? The colonel asked without diverting his gaze. Moon didn't respond. I could hear soft, high-pitched wheezing coming from his direction. The colonel noticed too, and turned around. Dr. Moon was completely motionless. Assuming he was just daydreaming, Thompson shouted, "Dr. Moon!" What happened next was the most disturbing, frightening thing I've ever witnessed. And that's saying something coming from a soldier like myself. Moon started convulsing violently before slowly changing into something. His arms, his legs, his fingers, his toes, his neck, all grew to double their length. Sharp teeth descended from his gums, and existing teeth broke into sharp points. His jaw disconnected from his skull, giving him a gaping, terrifying maw. One of the panels behind him gave me a reflected view of his back. His back split apart, exposing his spine, with each vertebrae having long jagged spikes protruding from them like a dinosaur. The same sort of spikes were also protruding from all joints of his body. His skin turned a dark green color and was now ripped, exposing bone and a powerful muscular structure. There was nothing recognizable left. I sprinted at Elizabeth and grabbed her arm, and we raced to safety. Pravina followed, but Colonel Thomas, rest his soul, wasn't so lucky. Moon, or what we thought was Dr. Moon, lunged at him with a high-pitched, unnatural screech, thrusting both arms into the colonel's chest, aided by the spikes that grew on his knuckles. Thomas didn't make a sound. He just went limp, with his arms dangling below him. His motionless body was lifted off the ground. I winced with horror. There was an explosion of blood and gore as the creature separated its arms, ripping already deceased Colonel Thomas in half. His blood-covered insides were scattered all over the floor. In all my years of military service, I've never, ever seen something even remotely as disturbing as this. With no time to mourn our fallen comrade, we moved into the mess area and closed the door, locking it. The two girls were sobbing. None of us wanted to talk about what just happened, or what caused it. Pravina noted, still sobbing. We need to kill it. Nobody ever guessed to pack weapons on this ship, as it was a mission of exploration, and this occurrence would never even show up in any manual. The three of us collected ourselves, and I cracked open the door. Moon was pacing the room, and then he noticed me. He produced another loud screech and charged at me. I got back inside just in time, and he started banging on the door relentlessly. Try and find something I can use as a weapon, I said frantically. We may not need one. We can just use the main airlock. There's a console in the communications room opposite this door that can open it, Pravina said, still shaking with fear. I opened the door, and the creature was in the middle of the room, standing above the colonel, as if it was admiring its latest kill. I threw a piece of metal past it, but the creature jumped at where it hit the ground. I gathered up all my strength and determination I could muster and bolted for the communications room. The creature saw me and got within inches, but I made it and sealed the door behind me. Dr. Moon, as if he knew what was about to happen, pounded much louder than before, almost desperate. I used the auxiliary console to increase the pressure and blow out the airlock. The environment outside the door sounded like a wind tunnel. The pounding ceased. I could hear it frantically claw at the ground before a loud puff sound as it flew out helplessly. I resealed the airlock and pressurized. Upon opening the door, both the creature and the colonel were gone, with deep claw marks in the ground and around the airlock. I looked up, and to my horror, it had completely trashed the command deck. All the consoles were destroyed, with no way to use them. We were basically dead in the water, with no way to control the ship. I called the girls out, as it was safe. They both took on my shocked face when presented with the carnage. "Can we activate the drive from the reactor room?" I asked Pravina. "Yes, but we will have no navigational control," she replied skeptically. With haste, we made our way to the reactor control room. The room was dissimilar from the rest of the ship. It had an industrial design. Pravina did her magic to try and charge the rings before another burst. There was no way to know which one of us would change into that thing. Her fingers tapped away at an inhuman pace, and then she froze. "No, no, 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 no!" Pravina screamed. "What?" Elizabeth and I responded in unison. "The rings! They're not charging! The creature must have hit one when he flew out the airlock," she said with a defeated look on her face. I felt as if the entire universe was trying to kill us. The three of us went to a window. We were shocked to discover that there was indeed a deep gash on the side of one of the rings. That meant the only chance we had was the main engines. We could get far away enough to try to fix the rings with a spacewalk. We had no way of knowing how far the pulse had an effect, so we wasted no time starting the engines up from the reactor room. Pravina put all available power through the engines, including the power from life support. 30 minutes later, we were going fast enough that I could perceive the organic star drifting away slowly. There were only 15 minutes until the next burst. The three of us took shelter with nothing left to do and separated ourselves with doors between us, just in case we were not far enough away from the star. The engines were still going. We were keeping in constant contact using the internal comm system. Elizabeth monitored for the burst. The three of us had never been so scared in our lives, as we now knew what was potentially about to happen. Our fate was inevitable. The burst came and went. The two started sobbing again. As far as I could tell at the moment, we were all safe. I broke down with relief, as it was one issue we no longer had to deal with. But suddenly, one of them stopped crying. "Elizabeth?" I called out. "I'm here, James. I'm here," Elizabeth cried. That same screech came out of the speakers. It was so loud, my eardrums were in searing pain. I called for Pravina, but it was already too late for her. She was in the pod room. Elizabeth was the only thing on my mind at the time. I had a clear path to get to her. She was in the communications room. I went over and joined her. We had an hour left. The two of us knew there was no chance of repairing the ring without Pravina. Pravina started pounding on her door as the transformation was completed. "I'm writing this from the communications room with Elizabeth. I don't know if my story will reach Earth. Even if it did, it would be too late for us, as it takes a whole 4 years with lightspeed communications. We're just too far away. Pravina just busted out of the pod room. She knows where we are. She's now trying to break our door down. I don't know how long we have left. I don't know what will get us first, Pravina or the next burst. All I know is we don't want to die in either fashion. I'm contemplating evacuating the air from this room. Elizabeth agreed, and I started sobbing uncontrollably. I'm embracing her with one arm and writing this with the other. The air is getting thin. Humans can survive about 6 minutes without oxygen. It is an agonizing death, but it is far better than the alternative. I don't regret going on this mission, and neither does Elizabeth. We're fortunate to make our world proud. If you're reading this message, please stay away from Proxima Centauri. It is not what it seems. The room is now completely void of oxygen. Elizabeth has gone unconscious. I'm devastated, but I know I won't be that way much longer. Only one thing left to do. Press send.